Ready to blow!
I fear no man, but that thing, it scares me.
Explosives, please!
No, I ain't talking about that freak, alright? He's not here, is he? How do I get this fucking thing off?
Thing's about to go boom!
One shudders to imagine what inhuman thoughts lie behind that mask. One dreams of chronic and sustained cruelty.
Now, listen, today is going to be a bit of a weirder video. This is just part 1 in a 3-part series that I'm making covering Driller. This part is going to be specifically about primaries, how they stack up against each other, and just how they work and like what mechanics they use. Part 2 is going to cover literally everything else that Driller has to offer. And part 3 will be the shortest and just be about the ethically dubious builds that his overclocks let you make, and some tips around the micro gameplay. So maybe consider subscribing if you're interested in seeing those at some point, or if those have already been released. I'm making more videos, probably, unless I've died, in which case I will not be making videos. Driller's class identity revolves around crowd control in close quarters combat and handing out debuffs like no one else can. His primaries are all central to creating this class role, and every other piece of kit revolves around this slot, more so than any other classes as its defining trait. Like, Scout is defined by his burst damage and grapple hook, Gunner is defined by the shield and sustained fire of his primaries. Engineer's primaries aren't even really a defining thing, they're just self-defense weapons, while his secondary platforms and sentry guns define his class role. But with Driller, it is specifically his primaries that create his playstyle that every other piece of kit is connected to, except for one, which we'll talk about.
Explosives, fly!
Before we cover Driller's primaries, I need to give you all a crash course on temperature mechanics in Deep Rock Galactic. This is what defines 2 of Driller's primaries, so if you don't understand the nuances of temperature, you're not going to understand the nuances of the weapons themselves. And just remember, this is a bare bones description. If you want to know more, check out the wiki. If I get something wrong, Greybeards, please leave a helpful comment for all the Greenbeards to look at, and for me, because, you know, always learning. Any percent speedrun. Alright, so every creature has a base temperature of 0. When a creature takes cold, the temperature drops. When a creature takes heat, the temperature begins to rise. Certain weapons and environmental sources deal out heat and cold. These lava geysers deal heat, these wind tunnels deal cold. Note that heat and fire damage are different. Heat affects this, fire affects this. Each creature has a unique threshold that once it gets hot enough, it'll be set on fire, and if it gets cold enough, it'll be frozen. Each creature also has a built-in warming and cooling rate that tries to keep the temperature 0. As you freeze something, you'll have to out-freeze the creature's warming rate, and vice versa for heating it up. Once a creature is frozen or on fire, depending on its cooling or warming rate, it will unfreeze or douse itself, ending the status effect, but not cleansing itself of all heat and cold, so it'll be easier to reapply a status effect before all the heat or cold goes away. So with that out of the way, now we can talk about the primaries. Now, when it comes to Driller's primaries, each one seems pretty simple on the surface, but all of them have a ton of mechanical nuances that shape how each fits into the primary slot and defines your specific type of crowd control and how you play around it. So let's just start off with the twins, Redmond and Blutart. I know, my state-mandated number of TF2 reference had to go up by 1. Now, CRISPR and Cryo are very similar to each other in a lot of ways. They are both designed around temperature and elemental damage. They each pierce through enemies in a beam, they both leave behind a lingering effect, and they even have the same goddamn tier 5 upgrade in the form of heat and cold radiance. which just spreads heat or cold in the area around you when you fire the weapon. This is a good modification, we'll come back to it. But it's a flamethrower and a freeze gun. I'm not gonna sit here and say it's the same thing, because they're not. They do two very different things that are all based on the status effect. Crisper is all about damage over time, leaving behind trails of napalm that quickly set everything on fire, and using that napalm to lock down areas. What really makes this possible are these. Sticky flames stick to the ground. Duh. Sticky flames will also heat up the area around them and deal fire damage to anything that is walking through them or around them. They also act as an environmental heating source. Wait, so what's an environmental heating source? I'm glad you asked, hypothetical viewer. So remember when I talked about how creatures naturally cool down when they start to get hot? Well, an environmental heating source turns off that natural cooling rate. This is really good for Crisper because when you combine the heat you dish out directly, the heat from sticky flames, and any creature in sticky flames can't cool down, it becomes very easy to set a lot of things on fire. Add in the slowdown on sticky flames, and oh, would you look at that, the Has 5 grunt wave is gone. And also, when you set something on fire, not only does it start to take damage itself, but it also begins to heat up everything around it, adding more heat into this equation, making tightly packed groups just begging to be set on fire. And when you put all of this together with the damage over time, the direct damage, and the lingering effect of sticky flames adding in more damage and heat, it makes Crisper great at handling anything that really wants to walk at you. You can easily throw down barriers to get in its way. But where Crisper begins to fall off with damage and you really need to start looking for other sources to deal with threats is when threats get either farther away, like with menaces, acid spitters, web spitters because of its limited range, or when threats become tankier, like Praetorians, Oppressors, Stingtails can be kind of hard to get through with just the damage over time effect. It begins to fall off against those larger threats because the damage over time obviously doesn't scale, so even though it kills Swarmers really nicely, Praetorians are a bit too much health to get through quickly. Now, Cryo Cannon looks at that and goes, nah, I'd win, and then proceeds to make everything that has scaling health in the game cry. Now, when it comes to the more subtle differences between Cryo Cannon and Crisper, Cryo Cannon's lingering effect is just not comparable to Sticky Flames. They're worse at base, with less range, less cold, they can't be buffed in any way except for one overclock. They aren't an environmental cooling source, so creatures still get their natural heating rate against your cold output, meaning that larger targets are harder to freeze. But on the obvious side of things, its status effect is a lot better when compared to Crisper's. So the Cryo Cannon obviously freezes targets. Look at the screen, please, if you don't see it. But what does the frozen status actually do? Well, frozen targets lose all weak points and armor, they completely stop moving, and they take 3 times direct damage from all sources. This also stacks with any weaknesses the target already has, so you can do stuff like this. Let me just reiterate on how good that 3 times damage is. With 3 times damage, M1K bullets from scouts start dealing 165 damage instead of 55. Shotguns getting triple damage per pellet means that each pellet does about 20 damage instead of the 6 to 8 that's normal. Stack this up over 8 to 12 pellets, you're getting crazy numbers per shot. And don't even get me started on how disgusting Gunner's primaries can get, and even his secondaries start getting with that 3 times damage. Like lead spray, Burt auto pistol, frozen Praetorian, it's gone. It's just gone. And just look at what Driller axes do to oppressors. Long and short of it, you and your teammates become stupidly good at killing everything with less ammo when it's frozen. However, due to the lack of a really potent lingering effect, like sticky flames, Cryo Cannon becomes much worse at handling large swarms of weak threats. And it also isn't that good at laying down barriers to protect your team or just seal off a hallway. The other downside when compared to Crisper is that you still have to kill frozen targets, because unlike fire damage, frozen targets just take more direct damage. They don't take any damage from the frozen status effect directly. To counter the cryo cannon's lack of horde clear and reliable lingering effect, we have to talk about cold radiance in tier 5, which is excellent at covering you from multiple different weaknesses. It really helps against being surrounded by glyphids because anything that steps within like 5 meters of you is going to get frozen if it doesn't have a lot of cold resistance. And in addition to that, it makes freezing things easier because you're getting more cold when you get closer to enemies. So with Cryo Cannon, your playstyle is much more focused on lasering down targets with cold until they get frozen solid, and then you can capitalize on that status effect with massive damage boosts to you and your team. And all of this combined with the lack of a lingering effect, the cold radiance being so important for this weapon, you gotta get in close, alright? And you have to be way more aggressive than with Crisper, which with Crisper, you really want to make distance between yourself and those big targets, so you don't get caught in Praetorian Spit, you don't get hit by big waves of damage, and you can get to cover easier against those ranged threats. Despite appearing so similar, these two weapons play completely differently, but still fit within Driller's core idea of crowd control. So basically, you've got one that does really good debuffs and really good at like being aggressive and getting in close and just manhandling those larger enemies. And you have one that is really good at setting up traps, lingering effects, doing damage over time, kind of slowing down bugs a little bit, but not really, and just being a little more passive. So what if there was a primary that did both debuffs and damage over time? Well, that sounds kind of broken, doesn't it? Alright, it's time we talked about Sludge Pump, okay? Listen. Cryo Cannon is Blutarch, Crisper is Redmond, Sludge Pump is Greyman. Now, this is just a weird weapon. I mean, look at it, okay? It's closer to a concrete mixer than an actual combat weapon. However, don't be fooled. This is one of the most terrifying weapons for ground-based foes in this game. Sludge Pump has very few temperature-based mechanics. Instead, it can either hit targets directly for a bit of damage, slowdown, and a damage over time effect. Or, it can cover the ground in puddles, which also deals slowdown and damage over time, but lose the direct damage of direct shots, but can affect multiple glyphids so long as they're walking through the puddle. So there's already a lot of information that goes into deciding where you want to place your shots. Additionally, puddles can be set on fire for heat and additional damage. On top of that, you can charge up shots for more damage, more puddles, and just a bigger area covered. And on top of that, all of your shots are affected by gravity. So what does this all add up to? Well, it means that this weapon is incredibly flexible in what it can do. It has great support by applying sludge directly to large opponents to slow them down. Just look at this Dreadnought, it's not going anywhere. This can also be a great way to force enemies to bunch up by slowing down the ones in the front, making them susceptible to large AoEs like grenades or lingering effects. You throw out damage over time like no one's business, so everything is just getting chipped down and weaker enemies just die in pools of acid. All of this together, when you combine the lingering effect, the direct damage, the slowdown, and the damage over time, that stacks, it becomes great at clearing hordes and locking down areas with sludge. And its range is pretty good on top of all of that. So you obviously must be asking, what's its downside? Well, it's simple. You get all this flexibility, but in exchange, it's more inconsistent and has a lack of coverage that the other two primaries don't have to deal with. These charge shots aren't perfect circles of sludge without significant investment into them, so it's not a perfect barrier because glyphids can either go around them or just like find a path through. If you shoot into a tightly packed crowd, you might not even hit every target, which is something Driller's other two primaries do not struggle with. And good luck setting up large areas of sludge on the walls and ceilings due to how gravity works, and unlike with Crisper's status effect, it's harder to spread around to glyphids because glyphids either have to have been hit by sludge or have to be physically standing in puddles to take damage, which is not something Sticky Flames has to deal with because if you set something on fire and then it leaves sticky flame range, it still takes damage. It might not be getting slowed down by sticky flames, but it still takes that damage. And what this means is that when you play with Sludge Pump, it is all about forward thinking and planning around your terrain and enemies. Do you think that you're going to need a big puddle or a little puddle? Is applying sludge directly or on the ground more beneficial? Where are the bugs coming from and going to? How do you position yourself around your puddles? Do you stand in them on one side? Do you bait bugs into it? Do you like sort of move away? Do you have an engineer throw a lure into the middle of it? And how are your overclocks affecting the elements of your gun? And like, these are questions that Sludge Pump users should ask themselves just because it's so interesting, you know? And once you start playing around with Sludge Pump, it becomes a lot easier to improvise with it. As you figure out how to arc your shots, you can start nailing distant targets with no problems. And it rewards understanding with versatility and creativity with results. It is an awesome weapon with some interesting drawbacks that more so add to how you use the weapon than take away from it. So you now have the triangle of Drillers Primaries. So to briefly summarize, Crisper is great at covering areas super effectively, spreading damage around in large swarms, and being able to consistently handle hordes of grunts with very little ammo while locking down areas. But it struggles against large foes that fire damage doesn't scale well against and can't really be slowed down. Cryo is the king of debuffs, coordination, and combos. Freeze a target, nail it with some form of direct damage. It's the oldest trick in the book and a classic 1-2 punch to handle larger enemies. However, it can't lock down areas quite like Crisper can, but it can hold its own and must be used more aggressively than Crisper due to that lack of sticky flames. Or sticky cold in this case, I don't really... Sticky puddles, you know, like the puddles just aren't as good. You get what I'm saying. And Sludge Pump is flexible, doing both damage over time and slowdowns, and it applies them instantly without needing a temperature bar to fill up, but it loses out on coverage and consistency of the other two. However, a clever player who understands the strength of this gun can set up devastating kill zones, debuff specific targets, take down large threats, and slow down the hordes like very few other weapons can. And it can do it super quickly. Now, I've said a lot of words in this video. If you are interested in what I have to say next time when we jump into Driller's secondary support and mobility tools, then subscribe, like, maybe share this video with a friend who you think will like it, and thank you for watching, alright? Until next time, lads, rock and stone! God damn it. Anyway, hold on. I'm calling in a resupply over here. Because, dang, you guys are out of ammo.
I have 324 bullets left in my
I have 20 shotgun shells, 4 breach cuts.
Okay.
Oh, and I'm
Are you fucking kidding?
Again? That's wild.
Who started talking about Grinder?
Yes, I did almost kill you, but I did actually save your life. Oh, well, no.
I tried to melee 1v1 a warrior and it didn't go well.
Yeah, you're
That
gonna...
warrior right there. Leave him.
Oh, that's a clip. That's a clip. Dude.